Almadex, it's not a typo. It's the joyous love child of Almaden minerals. This is a kind of intertwined story, so if I flip around and say Almaden, you'll know why here shortly. Almaden was formed 30 years ago roughly by my father. We're both geological engineers and continue to work together at Almadex. And last year, the discovery Brent so kindly mentioned, made in 2010, we got to the point where clearly we're moving into a development story with that project, but we're an exploration company with over 20 projects and about the same number of royalties that have resulted from a lot of work over the years. So we decided last year to spin out, as it were, all the exploration and royalty projects into a new company we call Almadex, while Almaden continues to develop the Ixtaca discovery, which I'll tell you a little bit about in passing at least here. Yeah, so just a quick summary. We've got about $6 million in working cap, and just a little, we have a different approach to exploration, and I hope in this presentation to kind of run through how we do things, how we've come up with these discoveries historically, and how we aim to repeat it. I think we've heard Brent gave a great talk here, and I would say that these are all symptoms of the financialization of the mining sector. Low interest rates, high capital and required for mining, that's a bad combination. So I mentioned the history here from 1986 to when the spin-out happened. Almaden had 78 million shares out, so pretty capital, we preserve our capital, we throw our shares around like, I don't know, something heavy, manhole cover, something like that. So yeah, we're both geological engineers, and we have a very, if I can move forward here, technical approach to how we do things. We got in a Hughes 500 and spent 10 years flying around in eastern Mexico. Geology doesn't stop at borders. We recognize that the eastern part of the country was very underexplored but had fabulous geologic potential. Combine the regional panorama with alteration. The left two pictures are alteration in active geothermal systems, which I studied. The right is the clay alteration that's above the discovery we made in Mexico. Very similar. You have to understand processes, and ultimately that's what resulted in our discovery. Having that kind of framework of knowing how these things fit together is helpful in the very earliest stages of exploration. So we've got banded material there in a pipe and a geothermal system, and the banded vein discovery we made in Mexico. We have our own geophysical equipment, so while we're looking at clay alteration that forms above deposits that's barren of gold, we have ways of looking through that, and this is a geophysical section. We have our own IP and mag equipment and laid soils on top. This is the discovery hole in the red area is what we drilled. It was completely blind to surface. First hole, we got very fortunate. We hit 300 meters of about 2 grams, and that was the start of that discovery. That's the hole that we hit there under all this barren clay alteration on top. This is from my helicopter journeys in eastern Mexico. There's the brown stuff is recent volcanic ash material, which is all over the countryside, and they're mining clay underneath it, this white stuff. And that clay is the stuff that forms above deposits. 50% of the gold ever produced is subsequent to 1980, and a lot of that has to do with the innovation of heap leaching. A lot of the near-surface heap leachable deposits have been discovered in many parts of the world, and you got to start looking deeper, and you got to have some science behind you. And so again, we start at very early stages, which is not very sexy, but we're doing it in a portfolio approach. But we combine it with something very unique, I think, and that's we drill for our own account. If you're waiting around for somebody else to drill your properties, it can be a long wait, even when you option them. So what we try to do is get in early and cheaply. We drill for about $35 a meter at Ixtaca. These drills are all Mexican team. We get these holes down to 1,000 meters, and very inexpensively. Most of those clay alteration targets aren't going to be anything. So very quickly you want to know if there's something there or not, and that's our philosophy with Almadex moving forward. We expect to drill things, they're conceptual targets. But that being said, we've did a little study. We or our partners over our history since 1986 drilled 28 different projects, and 8 have become resources or mines, or so not a bad track record. So I mentioned eastern Mexico. This is kind of how we define it. We think that there's an enormous potential there by virtue of the fact that the black blobs are where there was historic mines in the western part of the Great Basin or the equivalent in Mexico, and in the eastern part of the, far bigger deposits were found like the Carlin Trend and Bingham Canyon. So that's what we're looking at in eastern Mexico, and no one had really done a lot of work there. I wound up doing a whole bunch of academic studies on there that have been quite useful for us because we're literally defining the ages of these deposits, and we feel like we've changed the geologic map of eastern Mexico with our discoveries, which weren't out there. Our first discovery in eastern Mexico, I'll just back up here, is Caballo Blanco, which we have sold, and Almadex, I mentioned royalties, it retains a 1.5% NSR on this deposit. When we sold the deposit, we kept half of it, which is shown here. And it's what we call it El Cobre, which isn't particularly inventive if you speak Spanish, but it's a copper gold porphyry system. The interesting thing about being a prospector is there's some fabulous mines in very difficult locations. Grasberg, which I think is the world's largest gold mine, is located where there's equatorial glaciers. So you can make things work. I actually on the board of Almadex is somebody who spent 6 years heading exploration in Grasberg, and he said those high grades forgive an enormous amount of operational sins. So infrastructure can work, but as a prospector, it's best to go look where you're not going to have your mine stolen from you. Mexico is a great country in that regard. We heard about good jurisdiction. But also, you want to look for where you got a hope of developing a mine. We heard about good infrastructure, and that's our case here. We're about 10 kilometers away from Mexico's only nuclear power plant. We got power lines going over top of us. We're 100 meters above sea level. Porphyries, we've got grades that work around the world and some preliminary drilling, but we think we're high in this system. There's a number of historic holes that end in what we think is economic mineralization. But look, we're starting above 100 meters above sea level, not up very high in the Andes. So this portfolio of properties is led by this one. We're pretty excited about this. We've got those drills I was showing you. We got one of them on this project right now, and we hope to be able to demonstrate over time. Porphyries can be large, and so it'll take a few holes, we think, to find our way into the system, but some of the past drilling is showing indications that suggest this system could be very large, so we're excited about it. We've got a large portfolio of properties focused on Mexico, as I mentioned. Since 1986, we got into Mexico when we went public. We got into Mexico in 1992 rather, and we optioned El Dorado, their second mine, which they put in production. But at the same time, we optioned another property, which we just sold to McEwen Mining. It's right near their operating Gallo mine. So we have a large portfolio of things that aren't when you got 22 properties. We expect that optioning properties, joint venturing, selling them will be the way of advancing a number of them. You can't drill them all. So hopefully that's a good indication of the potential in the portfolio. So I'll just run through very quickly some of the underlying value whilst we're prospectors running around looking for something that doesn't currently exist. We also have some assets here, namely our royalties. We've got a 2% NSR in the Ixtaca deposit. We created that out of thin air for our shareholders when we created Almadex in the first place. Ixtaca has got a nice resource. We just updated our PEA. It's a 97% measured and indicated resource. We've drilled 460 holes with our own drills, and a PEA that 1150 gold is got a 30% after-tax IRR and about 1.5 million ounces in the mine plan. So Caballo Blanco, I mentioned, 1.5% NSR. There's a nice resource there, and it's been kind of mired in some permitting issues that I think will be resolved. It's a nice deposit and a good location. And we have an NSR in Elk, which is just up the Coquihalla Highway is a small, high-grade gold deposit that I expect to move forward at some point now that the gold market's moving around. So we're kind of bipolar here. We've got assets that underlie our value, but at the same time, we're out with our drill rig looking for the next thing. Thank you so much for listening.